So, as I said, um, had the British not been concerned about the Chinese, probably the British would have allowed the Northeast region to have cultural relationship. Yes? Oh, sorry. So, as I was saying, first important thing is that the British actually initially adopted the policies that they inherited from the Ahom, that is following what is known as the POSA system. And the POSA system, as I explained to you, is a kind of system where the British actually, or where the Ahom actually allowed the share of the produce of the fertile plains to be to be shared by the tribal people who come to cultivate in this region. This policy was one of the most successful policies of the Ahom. It is also part of that diplomatic processes that the Ahom was able to maintain their relationship with the tribal population in this particular region. I repeat again that after 1826, when the British had signed the Treaty of the Jandabu, they proceeded, or they adopted, or they inherited this ad hoc relationship that the tribes, or that the Northeast region had with the tribal population. And therefore the British proceeded with their political and administrative dominion over the region. And initially, as I said, British probably imagining that they were more powerful and that they could, take control of the region. Initially, they adopted what was then known as the punitive expedition, where, as I said, they use force and they try to control the tribal population. But however, over the course of time, the British realized, number one is that such expedition was going to be costly to them, and it affected their economic and commercial interest in the region. So therefore, later they gradually changed this policy into one of developing a congenial and strong relationship, wherein they built amenities, and then they allowed the tribal population to engage in the annual trade fairs in the region, where the tribes could bring their produce and take away the produce of the plain in the form of the barter system. As I said, the most important problem that the British faced was during the First World War. They were worried about British encroachment, and therefore, especially, they were worried about the Chinese encroachment, and therefore, being apprehensive that the Chinese could interact with the tribal population, especially in the Nefa region, they adopted a new policy, that is the policy of putting police outposts. And this was the first step in which the British actually tried to link the tribes to the rest of the Indian territory. And as I said earlier, I repeat again that this particular policies of the British, had the British not been afraid or not been worried about the Chinese incursion, the Burma during the First World War, Northeast might have, as I said today, developed closer relationship with the eastern population, or with the eastern region culture, as till today, you see, culturally Northeast population are considered as having closer cultural, ethnical relationship with that part of the world. So, therefore, uh, uh, in particularly in the Nefa region, the British could not realize that the tribal population had no common bonds with the rest of the Indian territory. So what they did was they followed a shadow of, they followed a policy wherein they instigated in the tribes, enmity, and since the tribes couldn't trust each other, There were so many tribes in this particular region. Since they couldn't trust each other, they continued to live in the shadow of mutual fears and hostility. And this, in many ways, added to the advantages of the British. So, so therefore, as I said, I'm going to cut the story short. The policy, therefore, was influenced, or the policy, British policy towards the tribes, especially in that part of the world, in the present day, you can say present day Arunachal Pradesh or Nepal region, as then known, was influenced by many factors. Number one was that the tribes in this part of the region, they were basically, according to them, according to the British, basically these people had no, as I said, interlinked cultural relationship with the rest of India. That's why the British had to keep a watch on this region. And this was almost the same kind of policy that the Ahom developed during the rule, because Ahom themselves, they were foreigners to this region, and therefore they had to circumspect, or they have to consider many various forms of factors. So since Ahoms were foreigners as much as the British, they had to identify themselves socially and culturally with the people, and therefore on the one side this was the issue, and on the other side there are other issues as well. So so therefore, as I said, very important factors that led to the British adopting what they say as the stick and the carrot policy is primarily because of this kind of cultural apprehension that they actually had with the tribal population. So in the case of the Nagas, the Ahom was adopting a very interesting kind of policy, particularly their policy of conglomeration of tribes. They wanted to bring all the tribes together. And how did they manage to do that? The Ahom, being shrewd in their diplomacy, they developed what was known as a system of the Naga Khats. Okay, the Naga Khats, wherein the tribals were given revenue, free land, free fishing waters, along with police, along with administration being granted to some of the tribes like the Noctis, the Wanchas, and many other tribes in the border of Assam, in the border of Lakhimpur, Silsagar, and so on and so forth. So these Naga Khats were managed by the Assamese agents known as the Naga Khatiyas, and in the Nepal region, the Mishmis of Lohit areas, they had trade relationship with the plains, wherein they exchanged the hill produce and barter for plain produce. So therefore, this was the kind of existing relationship that the tribes had with the plains during the Ahom rule, and this is exactly what the British also adopted. But finally, as I said, time and again, this led to confrontation. That is primarily because the British did not necessarily trust these tribes. So, so therefore, in the initial stage, when the Ahoms were controlling the northeast region, they especially, the Ahoms had these Gohains who were posted for the for making sure that there is no negligence of the rules and regulation provided by the Ahoms. So therefore these Gohains were sort of commissioners, or they were sort of superintendent to see that the tribes do not necessarily challenge the rule of the Ahom. So they adopted two important policies, that is the Boring and Aboring, where two distinct attitudes of the Ahom towards the tribes was being practiced. Boring means where the tribes who had submitted to the Ahoms agreed to abide by the rules and regulation, and as such, what do the Ahom did? They reward them. And Abori is another attitude where the Ahoms actually confronted those chiefs of the tribes who actually challenged the authority of the Ahoms. So in 1883, the British officer wrote that the Assamese army, he was pointing to the point that this policy of the Ahom actually allowed for the tribes to comply to the rules and regulation, to the authority of the Ahoms, and to the extent that many of the Ahoms soldiers were basically Nagas, were basically tribes who had complied to the rule and regulation of the Ahom. So therefore, this is something that the British had to learn and had to actually work towards, allowing the tribes to accept their rule. So as I said, the British officer wrote, Assamese army appears at this time, that is 1660, to have been largely recruited from Nagas, Miris, and it is evident that they were quite able to hold their own against the well-trained armies of Hindustan, which means by the time, by 1660s, the British had already seen that the Ahom had a very well-organized armies. That is because of their policy towards the tribes, who basically form composition of the Ahom army. So there were also occasions when they turned against the Ahoms, and therefore the Ahom adopted offensive policies, and then they also adopted what is known as the reconciliation and accumulation policy. So this was the occasion when the tribes invoked the help of foreigners against the Ahoms. But by and large, we can the British had observed that the tribes were basically in compliance, or basically they cooperated with the Ahom rulers and authority. So now coming to the British policy, we can say that the British inherited this ad hoc relation that existed, between the hill tribes and the Ahoms, and only it was during the time of the weakening of the Ahom rule, and also enfeebled by internal conflict, that the tribal actually started reacting and violating the obligations that they had to pay to the Ahom rule. So however, despite all such legacy, the British policy was rather different, especially to the tribes, as I said, in the Nefa region. So another very important factor is geopolitically, British were more advantaged. They were in more advantaged position than the Ahom had been, as I said, because on the western side they had no threats, and in the eastern flank was secure because they had already captured the Burmese region between 1824 and 1854. So therefore, the northern frontier with Tibet was dormant, as the Chinese had not yet become a powerful force, and they were not interested to come down. So therefore, we can say that throughout the 19th century, they sense absolutely no danger from this part of the region, but rather they were concerned with the Russian Tsar on the western side, and despite the fact that this region was safe through the what is known as the Hindu Kush, yet the British spent a lot of their energy, a lot of their resources trying to secure their western territory. So, so therefore, therefore, British in the first place were always embroiled in warfare on the western side, on the Afghan side, and so on and so forth. So, the first ever conflict that the British met was with the Singhos in the Nepal region, and to contain and push back the Singhos to their original home in Burma, the British had to use force. And along with this, the British also can be said to have engaged themselves in one of the philanthropic political objective, that is to try to abolish slavery that existed within this particular community or within this tribal groups in that region. And so therefore, British pushed the Singhos to the extent that they demanded for the release of the slaves kept by the Singhos tribes, and therefore also preventing them from further taking more slaves. And as I said, this was one of the early British encounter with the tribal population, and through this encounter they were able to contain the the practice of slavery by some of the tribal groups. And this in fact was being motivated by the fact that in England there was already the anti-slavery movement from 1784, and which finally led to the to the act known as the Slavery Act in 1811. So this was some kind of first act of humanism on the part of the British government in the hills of northeast region. So there are twofold advantages for the British here. One is that they were able to abolish slavery, and second is they were able to do away with the primary incentives for the rape of the Singhos, and this defined the new relationship between the Singhos and the Britishers. So, as I said earlier, of course, there are many other tribes in this particular region, the Khampis and the Noctes and so on and so forth. But largely we can say that the British also then followed the policy of started realizing that the postal system was important. In Tawang, where there is the age-old tradition of claims by the Monpas to the plains, they were bought by the British government at 5,000 rupees per annum, which means although the Monpas were engaging in the plains, yet the British paid them 5,000 per annum, so that after that the Monpas had to pay taxes to the British in order to engage in economic activity in the plain region. Similarly, the peoples of Shergon or so many other regions, they also followed this policy where they paid where they were paid money, and after that they had to pay tax to the Britishers. And this led to another conflict, by these groups, especially the Shergon, another tribe, especially the Tyagi Raja, the chief of, the Akas, another tribe. He revolted. In 1829 he was captured, and later in 1830 he was released. And after this, the British then changed their administrative policy, and they made Assam as the Chief Commissioner province in 1874. And therefore, through the 6th February 1874, the government of India, through its proclamation, um, they also developed this, as I said, the Chief Commissioner province of Assam, and Sir Robert Reid became the governor of Assam. And Robert Reid, later he wrote a very confidential letter to the British, especially during the time of independence, which is known as the A Note on the Future of the Present Excluded and Partially Excluded and Tribal Areas of Assam, where he instigated that these especially the tribal region, should remain as the should continue to remain as the British provinces in the form of what is later known as Regional Coupland Plan, or the British Colony Plan, where they wanted that this region should remain with the British, since before that they had already adopted so many policies which were paternalistic in nature, as well as non-interventionist in nature. And therefore these tribes, they are kept separate from the cultural relationship with with the rest of India, and therefore they gradually became very different from the rest of India, and therefore they wanted to instigate, they wanted to adopt this particular policy towards the northeast region. However, in the course of the conversation, in the course of their debate and conversation, it was realized that many tribes were against this kind of policy, because they argued that if the rest of India was going to be decolonized, then we also need to be decolonized, and we should be allowed to decide for ourselves. So while moving around in the region, the British officers, they realized the Lushais were against this, Khasis and Dantias were against this, and many other tribes they were against this. Even the Nagas, they had their own idea of how to counter the post-colonial engagement with the Indian government or the Indian state. So therefore, now coming to the construction of Northeast India, as I started from the very beginning. So Northeast India, as I said, because of the policies that was adopted by the Britishers, it became one of the most contested region. Primarily because this region is connected, you can say, to the rest of India through a narrow chicken passage of only about 20 to 40 kilometers average, between West Bengal and Assam. And this geographical location of the region was first described was first described as a boundary line or a tract. And according to the person who defined this region as a boundary tract, that is Alexander Mackenzie, he said that this region actually embraces the whole of the hill range of north, east and south of Assam Valley, as well as the western slope of the great mountain system lying between Bengal and independent Burma. So with with its outlying ridges and spurs and so many, so on and so forth. So this initial initial understanding of the region, of the geographical description, gradually got converted into political space when for the first time the British colonial regime started to demarcate their acquired empire to define the administrative jurisdiction between Assam province and Bengal province, as I said, 1874. So although the annexation of most part of the northeast started in 1826 with the signing of the Treaty of Yandabu, The process virtually came to an end only in 1898, and such therefore the region was initially earmarked under the Bengal Frontier Regulation Act of 1873, and which is known today as the ILP. The region was later then separated from Bengal province and became to be known as the Assam province in 1874. So this is the first policy in which the British actually started dividing this region as a separate region from from the rest of India. That is primarily because, as I kept saying from the very beginning, the British realized that the cultural affinity of this region is far more different from the rest of India. And so therefore, when this region became Assam province in 1874, it was also included as part of Burma, and was brought under one administration. So from that time on, the region became distinct in itself. It became distinct in itself as the British made the administration of the new province fall directly under the Governor General, while simultaneously providing for paternal governance, especially to the hill people. So let me again repeat, from the region being part of the Bengal province to the region demarcated separately, now the province directly falling under the Governor General, and therefore allowing the tribes to govern for themselves according to their own genius. So therefore this is the shift in the British policy towards this particular region. So along with this, there were various political apparatus that the British used, to which people like S.K. Chowke have argued that these are the political apparatus for segregating the region in general and the hill tribes in particular, which was employed by the Britishers. So therefore we can argue that along with all this, the British was constantly trying to develop this region into something which is different from the rest of India. So in 1874, along with the already being part of Assam province, the British also came up with a new policy towards the region, which was known as the Scheduled District Act of 1874. So they brought in this act known as the Scheduled District Act of 1874. What does this mean? This means that a part of this region, especially the hill tracts, as mentioned by Mackenzie, was considered as scheduled districts, which means these districts having different kind of administration, having different kind of self-governance, and free from the external interference, especially from other parts of the British colony or the British Empire in South Asia. So then the British in 1915 also brought in the Assam General Clauses Act, known as the Assam General Clauses Act of 1915, which means through this policy the British was again trying to define new policies where they say that all the acts, all the clauses that are applicable to the rest of the region should not be applicable to the Scheduled District Act. And then the Montague-Chelmsford reform of 1919 allowed for what was then known the backward area and the partially backward area, and then later in 1935 the British came out with a new name to this excluded areas, or to this backward and partially backward area, give them a new nomenclature known as the excluded areas and partially excluded areas. So all these laws passed by the British government of the time over the years, we can say, have had many, in many ways, made the region secluded from the rest of the Indian territory, despite both the areas being governed under the same colonial umbrella. So now, coming to all these aspects, we can also say that the attempt of the British to recognize the customary laws of the tribes in the region, with the implementation, as I said, of various political apparatus, was affirmed and recommended, and this recommendation was this recommendation was given by the statutory commission known as the Simon Commission for the need to protect the tribal customary rights. When the Simon Commission was given the responsibility to adopt new approaches to the Indian subcontinent, they came up with a new approach to this region, and as I said, the Government of India Act, which is the the outcome of the Simon Commission, considered two territories in the northeast region that need to be governed separately, that is the excluded areas and the partially excluded areas, with stipulated provisions that says that no acts of the central or the provincial legislatures would apply to them unless the governor in his discretion so decided. So basically, from this policy, we can say that the Indian government later adopted what we all know as the sixth schedule of the Indian Constitution, and out of the sixth schedule we have the autonomous councils in various parts of the northeast region. So therefore, as I said, these are certainly the political initiatives that could that could be argued as gradually consolidating for a sustained impact of solidarity among the people of the region, who are actually, apart from being part of India by default of the British administration, has largely never been in contact with the Indian subcontinent, and therefore they remain to be so even till this point in time when they are governed under the Indian administration of the Indian state. In the long run, we can say that the British policy, as stated by many scholars, many scholars have stated that it is a mix of autonomy and neutrality. And this prevented, in the first place, confrontation between the British and the people of this region, and also insulated the hill tribes from the mainstream political influences. So this insulation of the tribal region from the influence of the mainstream India gradually also paved the way for the tribal community to define their own political domain and strategies against the British expansion in the region, and without having any connection with the Indian freedom movements that already came about in the later phase of the 19th century. So, so therefore, even during the British rule, we can say that this assertion of politics of difference could be seen in various parts of northeast region and various tribal communities. So in 1933, the first of its kind, the kind of assertion of politics of difference was seen with the formation of the Tribal League, that highlighted the socio-political problems of the tribal population, alongside protests against the Bengalis' demand for territorial transfer of Golpara to Bengal. So this was the time when the Bengalis started the movement to demand for the transfer of Bengal to Bengal, transfer of Golpara to Bengal. Simultaneously, the tribal also started what was then known as the Tribal League in 1933, and they tried to argue that we are different from the rest of the other population. So again in 1945, a new political formation came about, which was known as the Hill Leaders Union, which was formed in Shillong, and their main concern was to articulate for their political aspiration as a unified but federal tribal unit. They tried to argue that we are tribes, we are all tribes, but we have our own. We have our own destiny. We have to be given the chance to decide for our own destiny. So later in the same year, then there was another political platform or another political movement known as the Plains and Hill Tribes and Races Association. In the same year, this was formed, and since these two organizations could not sustain for long, a year later, the IBM or the Indo-Burma movement was started by the tribal students studying in Calcutta in 1946. And what was the aim of this organization? The aim of this organization was to unite all communities from the land lying between the borders of India and Burma. And they wanted to argue that we are all one and we have to decide for our own political destinies. So from these organized political assertion during the colonial period, we can say that the politics of difference is being reverberated even in the post-colonial era, which means the assertion for the political differences started from the colonial period, and it got carried on even in the post-colonial period. So I will not go into the post-colonial period right now, because in the post-colonial period, to cut things short, we can say that even the Indian state had to adopt the similar policies that was adopted by the British. British considered the policy of non-intervention, policy of paternal government from the point of view of minimizing their expenditure, especially in administrating this region. So also could be the approach, could be the constitution of the Indian state. So therefore, we can say that in the post-colonial period, the Indian state, especially Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, formally created the Northeast Frontier Agency in 1971, and that was primarily because of the threat of the Chinese war or the confrontation of the Chinese, and which ultimately led to the international conflict in 1962, where we saw the Indo-Chinese War, and later, the Indian Union, through the constitutional mechanism, had to consider for the adoption of the sixth schedule and the formation of institutional mechanism like the Autonomous District Council. And therefore, in areas where the tribes wanted to abolish the traditional institutions, the tribes were allowed to govern for themselves, especially through the 1952 and 1953 Act known as the Assam Autonomous District and Regional Council Act for the Pawi Lakher region of Lushai Hill District. So therefore, as I said, these are some of the approaches of the Britishers which led to the autonomous assertion of this tribal region, and which, as I said, under intensified politics of difference, the idea of region of Northeast India could have been ended through decade of what is politically known as balkanization of the region that took place with the formation of 7 new states. So these assertions still remains even till today, and in 1971 the government of India came about with new idea, that is the formation of Northeastern Council for the purpose of developing this region. And again, in 2001 the government of India came out with another approach, with the development or with the establishment of a new ministry known as the Ministry of Development of Northeast Region, which was constituted by the parliament as an umbrella administration for the development of this particular region. So, so therefore, apart from the purpose of countering internal centrifugal politics, we have people like BP Singh who rightly argue that these institutions were created as a result of contesting national political ideas in responding to regional aspiration. So even he says that even the creation of DONER or Ministry of DONER was to ensure that they fit nicely for the emergence of a significant administrative concept, rather than resolving most of these aspirations of the people, or today the formation of new political identity within the Indian state, wherein the northeast region would assert themselves as being part and parcel of the Indian territory, the Indian state. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. If you have any question, please kindly address to me now. Yeah, please, if you have any question.